The history of life on Earth is fascinating. Almost as soon as the Earth cooled, life began to thrive. Small at first, but evolving into the amazing diversity of living things we see today over the course of about 4 billion years. In this video, we'll look at the major events that occurred over those 4 billion years to get where we are today. Earth's history is divided into 4 eons: the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. Geologists have used radioactive dating methods to estimate the ages of the borders between these 4 eons. By the way, I didn't pick the colors for those bars randomly or based on my love of pastels. They're the official colors for the eons. Seriously. The International Commission on Stratigraphy is a global organization of scientists who have created a standardized scale for the various time periods of Earth's history. Since the exact dates sometimes get adjusted when new data is collected, these people coordinate it all. They also decided on the official colors for each section of time. By the way, there are way more time periods and names here than I'll talk about in the video, but if you want all the details, check out their website. It's linked below in the video description. Back to our eons. That's a technical term, by the way, which is why I've underlined and bolded it. In the Hadean, which ran from about 4.6 to 4 billion years ago, the Earth was still cooling down, but that's when life appears to have started. The Archean is when photosynthesis begins, and that changes the entire atmosphere of the world, terraforming it, to borrow a term from science fiction stories. The Proterozoic is when we see the first multicellular life, something other than bacteria. And finally, in the Phanerozoic, we see living things that we can recognize: worms, mollusks, arthropods, fish, and everything else. It's hard to imagine a 4.6 billion year timescale, so thinking about Earth's history as a day is a useful metaphor. If we think of the 4.6 billion years as 24 hours, we can think of Earth's history starting at one midnight and the present day as the next midnight. We can then relate these ancient ages to times during that day in a way that we understand more easily. The Hadean starts at midnight and goes to 3:08 a.m. The Archean lasts from then until 10:57 a.m., followed by the Proterozoic, which lasts until 9:11 p.m., and finally we start seeing the kinds of life we're familiar with after 9:11 p.m. Spoiler alert, dinosaurs will come to the party late, at almost 11 p.m., but they'll get here, I promise. Let's look at the first eon, the Hadean. This eon lasts from our metaphorical midnight to 3:08 a.m. The Hadean Eon begins with the formation of the Earth, Sun, and the rest of the solar system condensing from gas clouds. Astronomers are the ones to ask about how this worked, but we have pretty good evidence that places this event at 4.6 billion years ago, give or take. Most astronomers also think that during this time, a planetoid named Theia collided with the Earth, bringing water and knocking the Earth on its side to create the 23.5 degree axial tilt we have that gives us our seasons. During most of the Hadean, the surface of the Earth was hot, like Hades, which is where the name comes from, and mostly unsuitable for life. Despite how terrible conditions were, there is circumstantial evidence that life, or something that made copies of itself and did complicated biochemistry similar to the way modern life does, got started near the end of the Hadean Eon. We don't know much about the details because it was so long ago. Subsequent life would have eaten the stuff from before, and there are very few rocks left on Earth from so long ago. We tend to think of rocks as permanent, but the truth is that rocks get recycled over geological time, and we can't actually find that many good samples from that far back. Studying the origin of life is an active field of research, and typically done by chemists and NASA. Chemists, because this isn't life as we know it, more like chemical reactions that can lead to life. NASA, because they're interested in what to look for on other planets that may still be in their own Hadean stage, or never made it past their Hadean. There's another video on the channel about the origin of life, but for now let's return to our list of the 4 eons. Our next eon is the Archean. The Archean starts 4 billion years ago and lasts until 2.5 billion years ago, 3:08 a.m. to 10:57 a.m. if you're using the clock metaphor. The name comes from archaic, which means old. The Archean Eon is when photosynthesis evolves, introducing oxygen to the atmosphere for the first time. We can see this in formations like the top one shown, where the red bands are from oxygen reacting with the material as the rock was formed. It's red like rust, which is also caused by oxygen reacting with minerals. There are very few fossils because, as I mentioned for the Hadean, the geologic turnover of rocks destroys almost all rocks, and the oldest rocks we can find are from about 4 billion, or 4,000 million, years ago. Also, life at this point is still single-celled, which tends to leave few fossils. Nevertheless, we do see some nice examples of fossil stromatolites. These are structures that we can still see today being made by cyanobacteria. The bacterial mats form mounds, and new layers grow on top of the older ones, creating layers of what is essentially rock as the whole thing grows. The few fossils from this time look almost exactly the same as slices through modern stromatolites. Even though we don't have great fossils or any DNA from so long ago, we can use geological data and molecular clocks to estimate the age of the most recent common ancestor for all current life on Earth. A molecular clock is the name for the technique of dating how long ago different organisms diverged based on how many differences they have in their modern-day DNA. This most recent common ancestor, MRCA, seems to have lived about 3.5 billion years ago. Another term for this is the last common universal ancestor, LUCA. There may have been other forms of life prior to 3.5 billion years ago, and there were almost definitely other self-replicating chemical systems as precursors, but that information has been lost to time. All we can do is work with what we have. Based on the similarities of all modern living things, we can infer a few things about what this LUCA was like. This organism would have had DNA, ribosomes, tRNA, ATP, and many modern genes, since these are deep homologies of all life. That is, all modern living things have these traits. Its exact nature is lost to time due to subsequent lifeforms evolving and replacing it. But if you think about how much we know about something that lived over 3 billion years ago, it's impressive. That's all we can really say about life in the Archean, so let's move back to our 4 eons. After the Archean, our metaphorical day is almost noon, 2.5 billion years ago. Next up is the Proterozoic Eon, which is the longest of all the eons. The Proterozoic spans about 2 billion years, right up until a special point in Earth's history 541 million years ago. The name comes from proto, for first, and zoic, for life. Like how a prototype is the first model of something, and a zoo is full of animals. The Proterozoic Eon is when true multicellular life and eukaryotes evolve. Eukaryotes are the organisms like us which have their DNA and chromosomes protected inside a nucleus in each cell. There are still very few fossils due to geologic turnover, but some clear examples do exist. In the pictures here, we can see fossils of what are obviously living cells from as far back as 1.5 billion years. By 850 million years ago, we see strings of bacteria, but these aren't true multicellular organisms since each cell's the same, they're just attached to each other. This first step does set the stage for cells to adapt and specialize, however. In just another 150 million years, we start to see fossils that resemble true multicellular organisms. We see fossils of true multicellular life starting around 700 million years ago. These organisms are really weird looking and predate familiar forms of life. They're called the Ediacaran fauna, and they took a wide range of shapes and forms. Sometimes we can't even tell if they're a plant or an animal. We also have no idea if most of what we see are ancestors of modern living organisms or not. The little phylogeny there shows what I mean. Obviously, some of the animals that were alive during this eon are ancestors of modern living things, but it can be hard to know for any particular fossil if these are ancestors or species on an evolutionary branch now extinct. Is that flat squishy thing our 100 million times great-grandparent, or our 100 million times great-grand-uncle or great-grand-aunt? The Ediacaran fauna dominate for about 160 million years, and while they're interesting, it's what comes next that really changes everything. Approximately 541 million years ago, or at 9:11 p.m., the Earth experienced the Cambrian Explosion. The Cambrian Explosion describes a sudden appearance of many novel fossil species around 541 million years ago. This is when many of the major groups of organisms, phyla, we know today, first became visible in the fossil record. An unanswered question is, what was the cause of the Cambrian Explosion? Was it a true rapid radiation of novel life forms? Did conditions change somehow to allow the sudden evolution of lots of new types of organisms? Or maybe there was just an increase in fossil-forming parts. For example, the evolution of shells may be due to predation. Hard to know. Whatever it was, and maybe it was a bit of both, we see a sudden increase in the types of organisms in the fossil record. We see many phyla which are now extinct and many others which appear for the first time. For example, we see members of all 4 of the major modern arthropod groups, but also members of what seem to be many other arthropod groups that are now extinct. Arthropods are a super diverse phylum of animals today, accounting for almost 80% of all named modern species. Arthropoda includes all insects, crustaceans, spiders, millipedes, and centipedes, but they're less than a third as diverse as what they could have been if every arthropod clade we see in the Cambrian Explosion had survived to the modern day. There are also numerous other species that defy modern classification. Anomalocaris gets its name from being an anomaly. In fact, when it was first discovered, experts thought that 2 different parts of it were different creatures. It wasn't until a full fossil with both pieces together was found that experts could fully recreate the entire organism. It was that different from what we understand based on things alive today. Wiwaxia has traits that make it look like either an arthropod or a mollusk, but it isn't clearly either one. Dinomyscus looks almost like a plant, but it has a mouth and anus like an animal. Emisquia, maybe a kind of worm, but who knows. These diverse creatures show up in the Cambrian fossils, but didn't survive long enough to leave enough descendants for us to figure out what they were. Another bizarre animal was named Hallucigenia, and when it was first discovered, experts thought the spikes were limbs and the tubes were dorsal appendages. Again, it wasn't until later, better fossils were found that we were able to correctly identify the tubes as the limbs and see that the original guess had been upside down. The Cambrian also gave us the first fossil that is unambiguously a chordate. The central nerve cord and pattern of muscles demonstrate this. Like we saw for the Ediacaran fauna, we don't know if this first discovered chordate is our direct ancestor or related to the chordate that was our ancestor. The Cambrian Explosion was perhaps the most important single event in the history of life on Earth. It gave rise to the major phyla of organisms we see today, and represented a whole-scale change from what had been living on Earth for the previous 3 billion years. At just after 9 p.m., life on Earth really got started as we know it. The Cambrian Explosion was such a change that we use it to mark the end of the Proterozoic. The next and last eon in Earth's history is called the Phanerozoic, which comes from phaneros, which means visible, and zoic, which means life. The Phanerozoic Eon spans the last 541 million years, right up to the present. In our metaphor, this is just the last 3 hours of our 24-hour day. Within the Phanerozoic, there are 3 important eras. These eras are the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. The Paleozoic spans from 541 million years ago to 252 million years ago. The Mesozoic spans from 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago, and the Cenozoic spans from 66 million years ago to the present. I like to remember these names as Paleo for old, like paleontology, Meso for middle, because both start with M, and Ceno for current, because both start with C. Broadly speaking, the major events in these eras are the transition to life on land in the Paleozoic, the dominance of reptiles during the Mesozoic, and the dominance of mammals during the Cenozoic. Using our clock metaphor, life emerged onto land between 9:11 p.m. and 10:41 p.m. Then the Age of Reptiles, which is when the dinosaurs were in charge, lasted for an hour from 10:41 to 11:40 p.m. And finally, at 11:40 p.m., the dinosaurs died out and the mammals took over for the last 20 minutes of Earth's history. The Paleozoic era is divided into 6 periods. The Cambrian is when the Earth had its maximum biodiversity. The Ordovician is when land was first colonized by plants and amphibians. The Silurian saw the evolution of jawed fish. The Devonian saw a massive diversification in the seas and is sometimes known as the Age of Fish. In the Carboniferous, amniotic eggs first evolve, allowing fully terrestrial vertebrates like modern lizards and mammals to evolve. And finally, in the Permian, Pangea forms, which we'll see is very important. At the end of the Permian, we see a large extinction event. It's not the most famous extinction event, but it's the biggest. Let's look at each of these in more detail. The Cambrian period had many different phyla, and some evolved mineralized shells, which meant that they left better fossils than the soft Ediacaran organisms. The land had mostly just microbes though. Essentially, a microbial mat covered the livable parts of land. The oceans were where the bigger living things were, including lots of arthropods. Most fossils were trilobites like the ones shown here. These were the dominant creatures in the seas for millions of years. The brand new behavior of burrowing evolves during the Cambrian. This breaks up the seafloor microbial mats and allows things other than bacteria to use the ocean floor. Predation evolves. It turns out that killing is one of the things that hard parts are useful for. In response, many species evolve shells as protection. This arms race of hard parts is another reason why this is when we start getting good fossils. Most of the land is a single continent, called Gondwana land, and the oceans are warm, which is nice, but nothing good lasts forever. As we reach the end of the Cambrian, the oxygen levels fall and the Cambrian ends with extinction events. Incidentally, the different eras and periods are usually defined by the different organisms living in them. For this reason, most of the time periods end with some degree of extinction and diversification just afterwards. There are 5 major extinction events that kill more than anything else. This extinction event isn't one of those, but that's how our next period will end. After the extinction event that ended the Cambrian, the Ordovician period begins with a second big diversification event. Arthropods still rule the seas as they did during the Cambrian, but there are more nautiloids like that guy to the right versus the sea animals all being trilobites and other arthropods. Arthropods and plants approach land. They make the first moves towards colonization of land, but there's little evidence that they really change the surface that much yet. In the oceans, it's not just arthropods and nautiloids, as jawless fish diversify. For a long time, these conodonts were only known from their fossilized teeth, but recent finds have shown that these were jawless fish similar in appearance to today's lampreys. There is also circumstantial evidence that jaws evolved during this period as well, but pretty much all the fish we see from this time had mouths like modern lampreys and hagfish without a lower jaw. Late in the period, the global temperature drops. The best guesses are that this was due to cumulative effects of photosynthesis or volcanoes spewing out lots of clouds. In addition to this, Gondwanaland moves to the South Pole, which results in lots of extinction of everything on land as it gets completely covered in ice. This extinction event is regarded as the first of the 5 major extinction events in Earth's history. Recovering from the end-Ordovician extinction event, the Silurian period sees the Earth getting warm again. Life on land really gets started, but oceans are still where the large animals are. Jawed fish arise and diversify throughout this period. We have clear evidence of lower jaws from fossils formed during this time. Bony fish, in addition to cartilaginous fish, arise and diversify. The oceans are now a hotbed of competition between large arthropods and the newly evolved bony fish. On land, this is when we see the first vascular land plants. Vascular plants are the ones that have xylem and phloem, which allows water and nutrient transport inside a plant, like arteries and veins in animals. Having xylem and phloem means that plants can grow upwards and grow larger since they're no longer restricted to staying mostly in water. Arthropods begin to fully colonize land now. Prior to the Silurian, the best evidence we have for arthropods on land is their tracks. But beginning with the Silurian, there are fossils of individuals in the rocks we study. The Devonian period is the age of the fish, due to the massive diversification of chondrichthyes, osteichthyes, and sarcopterygiae. These are the 3 major groups of fish we see today. Cartilaginous fish, fish like sharks and rays, bony fish, which are probably the fish you think about when you think about fish, and lobe-finned fish, like lungfish, which have actual bone in their limbs and can even drag themselves along the ground out of the water using their fins. The Devonian is when we see the first trees, seeds, and forests. The xylem and phloem evolved in the previous period are really being used now. This is also when we see the first tetrapods. These animals are amphibians, which evolved from lobe-finned fish ancestors. The pictures show 3 famous fossils from this time. Eusthenopteron was a lobe-finned fish that clearly lived a 100% water lifestyle. Nevertheless, its forefins had bones surrounded by flesh and muscle instead of rays with webbing between them like teleosts and most other bony fish. Acanthostega was another lobe-finned fish, but its anatomy looks more able to walk on land. The fins show more evidence of the beginning of digits, and their positions are better suited for dragging a body across short stretches of land. Most interestingly, Tiktaalik is a lobe-finned fish, but its fins are even more obviously used for some weight bearing. The arrangement of bones is similar to wrists to allow rotational movement, and they're connected to large shoulder bones for muscle attachment. The skull even has spiracles, small holes, that provide evidence that Tiktaalik may have had lungs in addition to gills. It also had fewer bones around the base of its head, allowing it to turn its head, which regular fish can't do. Tiktaalik really looks more like a land-loving animal than a fish. As we saw with Pikaia earlier, we don't know for sure whether these exact fish were our ancestors, or relatives of other lobe-finned fish that later evolved into modern tetrapods. Either way, the general trends in appearance and anatomy would have been the same. During the Devonian, Pangaea starts to form from pieces of Gondwanaland and some other landmasses. The Devonian finishes with a massive extinction at the end, the second of our 5 major extinctions. There is no single clear cause, but anoxia, lack of oxygen, leads to widespread death of a lot of plants. This plant material becomes buried underground by geologic processes and under high heat and pressure turns into oil and coal. Contrary to popular belief, oil isn't dinosaurs. It's mostly plant materials from this period and the next 2. Recovering from the anoxia at the end of the Devonian, the Carboniferous period quickly generates an atmosphere with the highest oxygen content in Earth's history. Arthropods are generally limited in size by their inefficient circulatory systems. But with such high levels of oxygen, this period gives us the biggest arthropods ever, since they were able to evolve to large sizes. The Arthropleura shown could get to be 2 meters or 6 feet long, and the wingspan of that Meganeura fossil, which looks like a dragonfly, was almost 1 meter. Terrestrial arthropods haven't been that big since. In the oceans, sharks diversify, including into strange sharks like the one shown there with a weird brush-like organ on their head. On land, tetrapods diversify, with amphibians like the Perderpes shown becoming really widespread. During the Carboniferous, the amnion evolves. This is the membrane in eggs that retains water yet lets oxygen pass through. This allows eggs to be laid in areas that aren't wet and opens up the entire world for reproduction, which had previously been confined to the seashore and lakes. The amnion allows reptiles, like Hylonomus, and synapsids, like Archaeotherus, to evolve. Synapsids are the ancestors of mammals, which come later. Towards the end of the Carboniferous, Pangaea cools, which leads to the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, which creates most modern coal, oil, and gas deposits. The deposits made during this period, combined with those from the next period, the Permian, account for about 90% of all the modern oil and gas deposits. This is actually where the period gets its name from. While most periods are named for where the first nice rocks from that time were found, like Devonian for Devon in southwest England, the Carboniferous gets its name from the production of carbon fossil fuels. The Permian period was dominated by the geography of Pangaea. The world was essentially a single landmass with coasts that were nice, but Pangaea had a desert interior since the ocean was so far away. I say the ocean because there was just one surrounding Pangaea. During the Permian, amphibians began to decline, but the diapsids, ancestors of modern reptiles, and synapsids increased. This would have been because they could move away from the shores to lay their eggs, while amphibians were still restricted to laying their eggs in the water. This is also when we see the first cyanodonts, like Proterozoic, evolve. Cyanodonts are the ancestors of mammals. Insects are starting to diversify, but about 90% of the insects seen are Blatopterans, which look like modern cockroaches. Plants are also evolving. During this period, seed ferns and conifers diversify. The Permian ends with the biggest extinction event in Earth's history. About 80 to 90% of all marine species die, including all the trilobites, which have been ruling the seas for almost 300 million years. About 70% of all species on land also died out. This extinction was so massive and widespread that not only is it our third major extinction, we use this event to mark the end of the Paleozoic Era itself. The end of the Paleozoic brings us back to the Phanerozoic and its three eras. 252 million years ago, or at 10:41 p.m., the Earth is decimated at the end of the Permian, and the first era of the Paleozoic ends. Next up, the Mesozoic, the age of reptiles. The Mesozoic spans from 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago and has three periods. Broadly speaking, the major events in these periods are the origin of dinosaurs and mammals, the origin of birds, and the origin of the first flowers and placental mammals. The Mesozoic is often called the Age of Reptiles, or, because dinosaurs are the coolest reptiles ever, the Age of Dinosaurs. Using our clock metaphor, the Triassic begins at 10:41 p.m., the Jurassic begins at 10:57 p.m., and the Cretaceous begins at 11:15 p.m. The Age of Dinosaurs runs for about an hour, with only 20 minutes remaining for life on Earth afterwards. The Triassic is the first period in the Mesozoic, and at around 250 million years ago, my personal favorite part of Earth's history happens. I present Lystrosaurus. The early Triassic period is dominated by Lystrosaurus, which accounted for about 95% of land vertebrates. Think about it, 95% of all land vertebrates were members of just a single genus. Only once has a genus ever reigned this supreme. These guys and gals were the survivors, and dominated while Earth slowly recovered from the end-Permian extinction. Unfortunately, nothing lasts forever, so the days of an all-Lystrosaurus world were numbered. The Triassic period was hot and dry, with all terrestrial life living on one continent, Pangaea. This period is when we see the first dinosaurs evolving. This is also when we see the first true mammals, instead of synapsids, in the fossil record. On land, seed plants dominate the terrestrial flora. In the oceans, modern corals evolve, and there's a huge diversification of ray-finned fish. This group of fish includes the teleosts, which are by far the most diverse group of modern fish. As the period progresses, archosaurs and dinosaurs dominate the land, and mammals go nocturnal. Mammals going nocturnal, living in the dark and the cold, has major consequences for the future. Mammals evolve fur to aid with heat retention at night. Mammals evolve a better sense of smell, and their ear bones evolve to provide better hearing, both useful when you're living in the dark. On the other hand, mammals lose two of the opsins in their eyes, trading much of their color vision, which only works in bright light, for better nighttime vision. The Triassic ends with a massive extinction, the fourth of our major extinctions. Conodonts, which had been living in the oceans since the Ordovician, go extinct. On land, about 40% of terrestrial tetrapods go extinct, including many amphibian and archosaur species. But dinosaurs and mammals survive the end-Triassic extinction event. The Jurassic period was warmer, about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius above the present, and more humid than today. At this point, Pangaea began to break apart into the pieces that would become the land masses we're familiar with today. On land, conifers diversify and spread widely, but we also see the first angiosperms, which will take over later in Earth's history. On land, the reptile groups diversify, and we see the first birds evolving from archosaurian dinosaurs. However, continuing the recent extinction, archosaurs as a group declined dramatically. Essentially, the only archosaurs that survive to modern day are crocodiles, alligators, and birds. Meanwhile, the other types of dinosaurs begin to dominate. This is the first of the two periods where the terrestrial world was ruled by dinosaurs. In the oceans, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs rule and grow to extremely large sizes. There is another extinction event at the end, but it's not as severe as each of the 5 big events. As before, dinosaurs and mammals survived to enter the next geologic period. The Cretaceous period was warm with lots of coasts as Pangaea fully separates into the modern continents. These modern continents become isolated, which is responsible for the different biodiversities of living things we see on the modern continents. Marsupials were never replaced by placentals on the isolated Australian continent, for example. On land, the angiosperms begin to diversify, and the conifers, after being the dominant large plants of Earth for 150 million years, begin to decline. Dinosaurs diversify and really rule the Earth, and pterosaurs rule the skies. There were lots of birds at this point, but they apparently weren't as numerous. The very end of this period is when T-Rex lived, which is interesting because the Jurassic Park book and movies make it seem like T-Rex lived in the Jurassic, but that period was about 150 million years earlier. I guess you can't believe everything Hollywood says about dinosaurs. On the other hand, Jurassic Park does sound better than Cretaceous Park, so that's why the author of the book chose that name. Even as dinosaurs dominate, we see the evolution of the first placental and marsupial mammals. They're still all small, but they're hanging on and persisting while the dinosaurs fill all the ecological roles for large animals. In the oceans, the ichthyosaurs go extinct, and now the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs rule the oceans. We also begin to see insects diversifying. We see the first ants, termites, aphids, grasshoppers, and precursors of moths and butterflies. This period ends with the big extinction event you've probably heard of. "66 million years ago, the 5th major extinction event ends the Cretaceous period of the Mesozoic Era. All the dinosaurs die, and so do a lot of other species. This is the last of our 5 major extinction events and finishes the last period of the Mesozoic Era. The age of reptiles ends, and the age of mammals begins. The Cenozoic Era, from 66 million years ago up to the present, has 3 important periods of its own: the Paleogene, the Neogene, and the Quaternary. The Paleogene spans from 66 million years ago to 23 million years ago. The Neogene spans from 23 million years ago to just 2.6 million years ago, and the Quaternary spans from 2.6 million years ago to the present. Broadly speaking, the major events in these eras are the evolution and diversification of mammals and birds in the Paleogene, the evolution and diversification of grasses and mammals in the Neogene, and the dominance of humans during the Quaternary. The Cenozoic Era as a whole, for obvious reasons, is called the Age of Mammals. Using our clock metaphor, all of this happens in the final 21 minutes of life on Earth. The Paleogene period is when mammals and birds diversify and begin to dominate the world now that the dinosaurs are all gone. This period sees the first whales and large mammals. Early whales, like the Basilosaurus shown, take up the role vacated by the extinction of the mosasaurs and the plesiosaurs who had just died out. In fact, even though DNA-based evidence and molecular clocks indicate that they diverged about 100 million years ago, this is when the 3 major mammal groups, monotremes, marsupials, and placentals, begin to be clearly represented in the fossil record. This is also when we see the first primates, rodents, and members of the order Carnivora. The Paleogene also sees angiosperm and insect coevolution, which allows, or causes, both to diversify. The close relationship between flowering plants and their insect pollinators allows both to thrive. Insect pollination seems to work better than wind-based pollination because angiosperms begin to replace gymnosperms throughout much of the world. Lastly, birds diversify due to the lack of pterosaurs and more insects to eat. Some birds even evolve to huge sizes and become the apex carnivores in the isolated continent of South America. These birds are known as terror birds. That picture shows how big they got, relative to a 6-foot-tall human. I'm not kidding. South America was a very different place back then, and Big Bird was real, but he had a much more violent attitude. The Neogene period really begins to resemble the modern world we're familiar with. In the oceans, kelp forests evolve, and we see the modern diversity of fish and aquatic mammals present today. The apes and artiodactyls diversify, creating many new species across the continents. Modern seed plants evolve, and grasses replaced forests worldwide. The widespread dominance of angiosperms over gymnosperms becomes complete. Near the end of the Neogene, North and South America connect at a new land bridge in modern-day Panama. This leads to widespread extinction of many South American groups, including many marsupials and the terror birds. And most importantly, some primates in Africa evolve larger brains and bipedal walking. By doing so, they free up their hands for tool use and begin to live a brand new lifestyle, one based on brains instead of muscles or speed. This brings us to the Quaternary, the third and shortest period in the Cenozoic Era. But since it's the most recent, we'll look at the smaller epochs within it. The Quaternary is divided into two epochs, the first of which is the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene epoch lasted from 2.6 million years ago to around 0.01 million years ago, which is just 10,000 years ago. The Pleistocene was characterized by numerous major ice ages. All across the world, there was a major extinction of large animals. This may have been due to climatic factors, or it may have been due to the widespread populations of early humans and their novel hunting techniques. Africa was less affected, however, perhaps because their large animals had evolved alongside humans and had behaviors that kept them from being hunted as easily as large animals in other regions with no human contact. This is why, although there are some big animals in lots of places around the world, the largest diversity of big animals is in Africa. Near the end of the Pleistocene, a major drought in Africa ends and a new species, Homo sapiens, arises. There had been other species of organisms that looked very much like modern humans all over the world for a few million years, but Homo sapiens was different. Around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, at the very end of the Pleistocene, a few brave Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa. By our clock metaphor, this is the final 2 seconds of the day. Imagine what it was like for those few brave humans migrating out of Africa. While they would have looked very much like the modern humans in the video, they traveled without phones, GPS, or the modern fabrics and clothing that we have today. Modern humans outside of Africa represent just a tiny subset of the genetic diversity still present within Africa, and while superficial appearances may differ from place to place, Homo sapiens is a single worldwide species. A species that just started spreading in the final 2 seconds of Earth's day. Now we come to Earth's most recent epoch, the Holocene, the final 2/5 of a second of our day. The Quaternary period's Holocene epoch is a geologically warm epoch coming out of the recent ice ages during the Pleistocene. About 10,000 years ago is when recorded history begins. Obviously, people were developing cultures and having lives before then, but without written records, we will never know what their lives were like in even the sparse detail that we have for the ancient Babylonians, Greeks, Mayans, Egyptians, Chinese, and other ancient literate cultures. Who knows what kind of lives people had before the cultures we have names for? During these last 10,000 years, Homo sapiens becomes the dominant animal worldwide, with a population which explodes from a few tens of thousands to multiple billions. The reference shown, and linked below, estimates that the total biomass of humans and their mammalian livestock now exceeds that of all other wild animals combined. The same paper also estimates that the biomass of human domesticated poultry is about 3 times higher than the mass of all non-domesticated birds. Humanity has become the dominant living organism on Earth. And migration has resulted in most humans and their biomass now living outside of Africa. Looking at that map, more humans live inside the red circle than live outside of it. The Holocene also sees a new round of mass extinctions, mainly due to human beings. In fact, the severity of species loss has led some scientists to declare that we have now entered a 6th extinction that rivals the 5 we saw earlier, which reshaped life on the planet. Most recently, the CO2 content of the atmosphere has increased by about 50% in just the last 200 years. It's been higher than that in the past, during the Ordovician and Triassic periods for example, but it's never changed so rapidly. Life will persist and evolve, but what the future will look like is unknown. And here's Earth's history at a glance. A copy of this figure and slides of this entire video are available on the EvolutionExamples website. From over 4.5 billion years ago in the fires of the Hadean, life has arisen, evolved, survived 5 major extinctions, and diversified to give us the amazing biodiversity we see around us today. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button or leave a comment. Share this with others you think may like it too. You can also subscribe to get notified when other videos go up on the channel. Doing any of these things also helps this video get seen by more people here on YouTube. The EvolutionExamples website has a bunch of completely free evolution-related resources, including organized links to our other videos about evolutionary biology. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.